Wow, thank you, Laura. Thank you, CSS Conf. My first conference ever, tech conference, was the very first CSS Conf in Florida, I think in 2013. So I'm just super honored to be here and never been to Australia, and I'm definitely coming back. So I'm also super excited to geek out on Grid with all of you. I've been geeking out on it for like the past year and a half. Basically, Laura said everything you need to know about me. I'd rather talk about Grid than myself. She also asked the question I was going to ask, which is like, who's using Grid? So I saw a couple hands come up about using it in production. Anybody just kind of like toyed around but not really used it yet? OK, a little more hands. Cool, cool. So the angle of this talk is very intentional. I want to give you something that you can take away and use right now. I love going to conferences. I love going to meetups. I love hearing about new things. But I often go through something like this, which maybe you've also experienced, which is you hear what the talk topic is about. You're kind of excited. You're interested. As you're learning about what it is, you're getting really excited. You're thinking about how you're going to use it. And then there's a point of like peak level excitement where it just falls off a cliff, and that's the minute when browser compatibility is mentioned. And it turns into something like, well, you know, Safari has this, but maybe in 5 years we can be able to use it. So CSS Grid is not like that. We can have nice things in CSS, but Grid is nice. And it's intentionally nice. It was rolled out in a way to try and avoid that mess. And so I just want to talk about that a little bit because I think it will give you some confidence in why you can use it right now, a little bit of the history. So Grid was not rolled out with vendor prefixes like Flexbox, its sibling. It was developed under feature flags. So it's been worked on for years in browsers, but you can only use it if you enable that in your browser, like personally through settings. So it wasn't able to be used in production, but it was able to be tested and iterated upon. So what we end up getting, so this was a little over a year ago on Can I Use, you can see there's like these little green flags. They're saying, oh, this feature exists. It's just behind a feature flag. And then we go straight to like green, ready to go, no caveats, ready. We'll talk about IE and Edge in a moment. But today, today, this is at like 87%, including the vendor prefixed version. Unprefixed, 85% globally of browsers use Grid, and like there's no exceptions really. This is a very well organized, like browsers cooperated with each other, and it's a very few bugs exist in this. Like, this is ready to go now. It was intentionally shipped last March, ready to go out of the box. IE. But it's not so bad. So I kind of lied when I said it wasn't vendor prefixed. The original version of Grid was actually made by Microsoft back for Internet Explorer 10 in 2012, but they abandoned it. But it's really kind of a raw, earlier version of what we have now. So it has some of the same syntax and some of the same features, but it's a little different. Two people I'm going to mention all the time are Rachel Andrew and Jen Simmons, because they have just a ton of amazing content about Grid if you want to learn things about it. They've been evangelizing this for years. But Rachel Andrew really goes into the difference in this article. So at the end, by the way, I have a link to all my slides, because I have like a million links to resources, because I could stand up here and talk all day, but I don't have the time, so I'm trying to give you the resources. But I don't want you to worry about that. I just mention it so you know it exists. But what I'm going to do is show you step by step how to write Grid without ever having to worry about the vendor prefixed version in Internet Explorer, while providing a bulletproof fallback for Internet Explorer or any browser that doesn't support Grid. And we're not even going to need JavaScript or any external dependencies. So, but if you are looking for a little more, I'm going to show some examples, so you'll get to see some Grid code in action, but A good place to start is a new video series by Jen Simmons that's on YouTube. She talks about more than just grid, but this video in particular is like a good starting point if you want to learn about grid and how it works. So our example today in our step-by-step guide to grid. Actually, first, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about Flexbox versus grid, because there seems to be a lot of conversation that's about, well, why do we even need Flexbox? Grid is replacing Flexbox, but that's not the case. Grid is just another tool in our tool set in CSS to use when it's appropriate. And what makes it so powerful, it's a tool that we've been using the other tools that weren't made to do this to do. So now we finally have something that's made for these types of layouts that we've been trying to not hack, but by illusion, make work for us. So Flexbox has been like our iterative step towards that, right? So Flexbox is great for laying out items in rows or columns, but even though it looks like a grid, we still only have content flowing in one direction, right? It's just wrapping, and we have to tell it to wrap. And we get into these kind of scenarios, right, where like every element needs to be perfectly sized for us to make our layouts work, and we have to control all the little child elements to make sure that everything works. So what makes grid different is it allows you to lay out elements in two directions, rows and columns, independent of each other. So besides positioning, like absolute positioning, we don't really have anything where we can really set exactly where we want something to be, independent of what's around it, but still not have it come out of the flow of the page. And grid allows us to do that and was built for that. So the first kind of thing you might think of is like, this looks like every grid framework, like homepage. These are things you can do with our website, right? Like thick columns of rows and columns. But I would advise you not to think of it like that and think of it more like this, of lines of columns and rows, and elements in the grid sit in between the lines. So to complete step one, when normally reaching for a layout property like Flexbox, floats, or positioning, just consider grid and give it a try and see how it works. And this is how I started to kind of get into it. And sometimes I'd abandon it. Sometimes Flexbox was actually better for what I was trying to solve. But it doesn't take much time to give it a go and see how it works for you. So this is my little example. This is a little side project I did. I'm going to pull up the real thing. So this just, you enter a place, and it gives you results from Foursquare of restaurants near that location, but it shows you like the featured picture from there. So this is like your typical use case for some type of grid, right? Whole bunch of like things in a row. And let's go back to my keynote. Cool. So this is the grid code for this, starting with the markup simplified. So grid works a lot like Flexbox. How's everybody feel about Flexbox? Everybody use Flexbox? Yes, okay, great. So grid works like Flexbox, where it has a parent element that you display grid, and then it just affects all its direct descendant children and like fits them into that grid. So here I've got a simple unordered list with list items. And this is all I had to write to complete that layout, 4 lines of CSS. And what I didn't show you before was that it's totally responsive without any media queries in 4 lines. And so basically this is nice, we can see it both behind here. So basically what this is saying here, without getting into the nitty-gritty, is, hey, everything inside search results, direct children, I want you to be on a grid. I want you to just browser figure out how many columns you need, fit them in, but I want them to be at least 320 pixels wide. If they need to be bigger, just make it however big it needs to be to fit it evenly across the screen. And I want 10 pixels in between each one, and then 10 pixels around the edge of the whole thing. So looking at that here, so the browser's thinking, OK, can I fit 2 across at 320 pixels? I can't. I still can't. But now I can, and have the 10 pixels. And then you continue to go, and it just does all this math that we've been doing for ourselves for us, because computers are really good at math. So it's about time we let the browser do that for us. So that's exciting. So if you want to learn more about those specific values, and the FR unit, just like a fraction unit, which is a new, really powerful unit value, you can check out some references there. So now the really exciting part, we can just fall back gracefully using a feature query, and this will cover all of our bases for browsers who don't know Grid. So anybody familiar with feature queries? Who's using feature query supports? Oh my gosh, you are going to be so excited, room. OK, so Grid is the perfect place to use this, but I think we're going to be able to use this in so many new things in the future. So a feature query is like a media query, but instead of saying a browser width, you say a CSS property and value, and it checks if the browser knows that. And if it does know what that is, it'll run the code inside of it. So here I've wrapped what I did before, the Grid code, in a feature query. And so they are pretty well supported, but what makes them perfect for Grid is that every browser that supports Grid supports a feature query, so it's perfectly fine to use. So again, our little friend IE doesn't support a feature query, but that's OK, because we'll write our fallback, which is just whatever we would have done before Grid. In this case, I'm just using Flexbox. And I know this is small, but I just have at the top my fallback, which is the Flexbox, and then right underneath I have my feature query with Grid, and then that's it. So my browser, like a browser like Internet Explorer, is going to read search results at top, display Flex, understands that, it's going to get to supports display Grid, and it's going to be like, I don't understand that, and skip it. Whereas a browser like a newer version of Chrome or Firefox is just going to override the earlier default styles because of the cascade, to our advantage. It's just going to override what's above it. So this is pretty solid. The only thing to really remember is what I just said, order matters. Have your fallback first, your Grid code last, so it can override the default styles. And then the only other thing to consider was that there were at the very bottom here, I had to override some of the things I was doing to the children to make the Flexbox work, just cancel out margin and make an auto width. But that's really not a lot of code, right? Few other considerations that are just little gotchas I came across in the past year. Auto prefixer. Grid now is disabled by default in auto prefixer, and that was voted on by the community because for this very reason, let's just not even deal with vendor prefixes if we don't have to. We have a fallback, and just let that work in the older browsers. So this is the default since about June or greater, but you can also set it in any older version of auto prefixer in the config for auto prefixer. Another gotcha that I've personally come across because I work in a lot of Ruby on Rails projects is that Sass Rails runs an old version of Sass still that doesn't understand all of the syntax. So it'll still work, but it totally broke the test suite because it was your Sass is messed up. So I had to find some workarounds with that some of the syntax didn't work, and I have some examples of that. But I haven't come across any other problems in any other stacks. But that could be something that you run into. That's it. That's it. That's so easy. And so I'm looking at time. Oh, yes. OK, because I've got some examples, and I'm just going to kind of go through the examples in the time that I have left. And my disclaimer, is it's okay that when I look back at my old code, I sometimes say, whatever was I thinking? That means I'm still learning and growing. I'm going to show you some bad code I wrote, and I'm not scared about it. This is the best bad example. So this is the first time I used Grid in a client project, and this was like a year and a half ago, so before it even shipped. But I was like, this is going to be fine. But this is a good example of like, what can CSS Grid do that I really couldn't do before? And I'm using media query with Grid here, even though I know we kind of talked about maybe you don't need media queries, but in this case, it made sense with what I was trying to accomplish. And I can also like I'm controlling the, but here, I'll just show you and then we'll talk about it. So I'm also using Firefox nightly because Firefox has the best Grid dev tools, and I'm using nightly because I want to try and get all the new stuff as soon as it comes out. So this is the actual website. This is a client project I haven't worked on now for like a year. So that's also a disclaimer, I guess. But this is like a basic blog for them, like alongside their product offering. And so this is like any standard index page. I've got a featured article, and then I have a list of articles. And so what was special was that I've got this list of articles that's generated, in Ruby on Rails, but then I have this little newsletter sign up. And so the request from the client was that we want a newsletter sign up, but we want it to be like kind of up and near the top, but not totally at the top, and we want it kind of integrated in the list. And so here, like, as this becomes responsive, it just kind of moves down a little bit, but is kind of always staying to the right. That's where I wanted it to be. But then when we get to a smaller screen, it just goes to the bottom. That is really long. That needs some pagination, right? So what's going on under the hood here? I'm going to make sure this is nice and big. Does that look okay? Okay. So these dev tools are awesome. So here in Firefox nightly, if I click this layout tab, see I've got a little grid thing here. It'll show me any place, any element that has grid on the page. I can click on it, and now it's given me this whole like visual grid so I can troubleshoot. I can also like change the color to make it something that I know can stand out against my background. I can take away the line numbers, but I don't want to do that because they're really helpful. I can also then press this little button here, and it'll go to the element in the inspector that I'm on, and then I can easily just go to rules and see what's going on. So likewise, I can press this and like turn on and off that cool grid. This is the waffle icon. Also, this is all coming for Flexbox in Firefox 2, this kind of inspector. So one thing that I noticed like 6 months later is like, look at my grid code. It's broken. That totally doesn't work. Hold on. Actually, I was futzing with it, and I made it right, so let me reload. There. Alert. That's not valid CSS. So I only have display grid and grid gap 3M, but I had this whole layout. This is working. Why is this working? And it's because the browser's smarter than me, and Grid is very forgiving. So my DOM has all of the articles, and then at the very end, that little subscribe widget, right? So that's a subscribe widget I am intentionally placing on grid column 3, grid row 2, right? So grid column 3, grid row 2. So the way this code is written is I'm saying just start here, and it knows to only take up one square, like one grid area. I could tell it to be bigger, but in this case, I just wanted it to be that. So Grid was so smart, it's like, oh, since you're placing something here, I guess you want at least 3 columns. So I'm just going to make you 3 columns. And so I have this wrapped in a media query so that when we go down to the 2, it switches to the next column. Where to go? Subscribe. It should say grid column 2. OK, that's fine. It just switches, so I tell it to go to like 1 more in between. And again, the browser's just being smart and filling out everything else around it. So that's really nice. And the reason why that syntax is broken is because of what I said before. It was the repeat syntax, which Sass Rails didn't understand. So basically what I did was I tried to make the layout work, not totally understanding what was going on with Grid. And once it worked and didn't break the test suite, I was like, cool, I did it. But I didn't realize how I had done it by stylizing that little subscribe thing. But one other thing I wanted to point out, too, I did this in a Codepen just to visualize it a little better. One thing I didn't think about at the time was accessibility. So like I said, the whole DOM, like it's all the articles are in one order. So if I'm tabbing through, it's tabbing through the DOM order, right? So that's something we need to consider. With all this great power comes great responsibility. And we need to make sure, even when we're doing things, that we still make things accessible. Is this accessible? I'd love to talk about it. I'm not sure. I don't think it's the worst, but it might be. So if you have an opinion about it, come find me at the party. Cool. And so my next example is this was another client where we had to rewrite their homepage because they were using React, and then we didn't need to use React, and then all the CSS was like written to be like just for React, and so I had to rewrite it. But I took the opportunity then to make things better, and one of the things that I did was this article like widget of 4 articles plus the newsletter at the top here was masonry. And it was the only place on the site that masonry was being used, and it just felt like too heavy, right? That there was another way to do this. So I thought, well, I can do Grid for this. And again, I wrote this before Grid had shipped completely. But actually, we'll go to I have like a Codepen of this one too, which is a little easier to see. And I also have a Codepen collection that I have a link to on my slides that just have a whole bunch of Grid examples, the ones I'm showing, and then some more too. So I'm also using Sass in this Codepen. But this is also a cool example of one of the other ways to write Grid syntax, which I love, which was the first thing that got me excited, which is if you look like up here, these like Grid template areas, like you just write it like how it looks. How cool is that? Like it's like ASCII art in your CSS. So I just basically here like declare my Grid size, so I have the columns and the rows, and then I just say, I give a name for each space that I want something to go in, and then I tell it, and here I did it in this little Sass loop, I say, give grid area to the name of the child, and then like the number I want it to be, and then it just places it. So, like if I look at this guy here, so we've got, and the inspector tells us the names to grid area names, so I can help troubleshoot. So these 2 grid areas make up the article 1. That was neat. And so in this case, too, I ended up doing a float fallback because since this was a larger client and like an international client, I just thought if I'm going to fall back, let me fall back all the way to something, and it's the home page, something that would work everywhere. Cool. Then my last example is a prototype I made for a client of an article page that we ended up not going with, but I love it so much. I want to like build my own personal blog so I can use it, but I don't really want to write articles. I don't know if you ever run into that. I always want to build a website for things, but I don't necessarily want to do the thing. So this is just like a nice looking article, but what I was trying to accomplish here was I want a background image that's going to be 100% vertical height of the browser, but I want it to just fill whatever space it can based on the size of the image. It could be any ratio, any size, and not stretch all the way wide. So like you can see this like there's white space, but when it's the right width, then it becomes responsive. And I wanted to be okay with white space. Like, we can have white space, it's so nice, but clients never think it's nice, right? And then I wanted my article header to be flush to the bottom, overlap, but also be able to be any height depending on the title of the article, and I want it to kind of like go to the edge, right? But like, just overlap a little bit so there's some space over here. And then I want my article to be centered underneath it, right? So when you really think about like how to accomplish that without grid, I started to do this, and I had some crazy DOM things going on. Because I had to overlap things, and I couldn't make a nice, clean HTML for this. So I stripped that down. I wrote the HTML I wanted to in the way I felt like it should be presented, and then used grid to accomplish it. So this is what I ended up doing. So I have an article, display grid. So I've got 3 columns, 1 FR, min-max auto 73 characters, because I really want that column to be, the middle column is the width of the body, and I want that to be the text, like 73 characters is a nice text readable length, right? I feel like I've not been using that character unit the way, like that's so great. I'm always like counting it and figuring out how many M's that is, but character units are great. And then I have 2 rows. The first row is 100 vertical height, right, for the image, and then the second row is just auto, however long that body content is. And so this is an example of like grid column 1 through 4 is going all the way across. So this image is as wide as the entire, yeah, see, this is one problem. So it's as wide as the entire screen. Another way I could write that just to confuse you, is, you remember we saw some negative numbers? So let's turn on my little line numbers. Oh. Anyway, here we go, back. I've got towards the bottom some negative numbers here. So I can place things based on the right side too. I either can use positive numbers, which start in the top left corner, or negative numbers, which start in the bottom right corner and then go in the other direction. So that's also pretty powerful and cool. All right, so just to wrap up, I have a million resources, and you should check all of these things out. I want to specifically point out the top one, from Bootstrap to CSS Grid. Natalia Shelburne, she works at New York Times and is using Grid on the New York Times, and has this great article about how, like, I think it's like 8 lines of code that just cancels out any Bootstrap and then uses it as a fallback, and then she can have like Grid for the other ways. Anything by Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrew is awesome. I have a couple of things. This is like an article I wrote, which is basically this talk, and my Codepen collection of some examples. And you can find my slides at my website, or even more specifically here. But if you want to talk about Grid, I could talk about Grid all day. Come find me. Thank you.